The only section we cover in Chapter 5 is a special type of economic application called consumer and producer surplus. And it has to do with a special type of area that we want to find. So where we are, it's going to involve a special type of integration. So it's an application of supply and demand, and consumer surplus and producer surplus kind of go hand in hand. Alright, so first, to remind you what supply and demand are. Supply and demand have to do with if you're a market, right? Demand goes up when price goes down, or vice versa. If you've got a high demand, price goes up. So again, it's a supply-demand kind of thing. And then manufacturers are willing to supply more items at a higher price, fewer items at a lower price. All right? Again, the market equilibrium kind of fluctuates around what's called the equilibrium point. And actually, that's the one we're going to look at, sort of the perfect market equilibrium point. All right, so the demand curve gives the price at which the consumers are willing... So, demand curve, what it is, it gives the price at which the consumers are willing to pay for X items in this particular market. Demand is always a decreasing function. Right? Demand goes down when price goes up. Right? Fewer people can buy it if it has a higher price. Supply, in terms of price supply, where the price is the supply price of the units, X is how many units they're willing to supply at that price. Right, so the supply curve is the function that gives the price the producers, the manufacturers, are willing to accept for producing X units of an item. Alright, so again, this is usually increasing. The more people are willing, the higher the price, the more they're willing to supply the items. Alright, so supply and demand are related in such a way where, usually in a competitive market, the supply and demand usually fluctuate around or near what's called the equilibrium point. And the equilibrium point is over the perfect market, where the price is perfect, the demand will be met, and the supply will be enough. Right? You'll supply exactly the amount that will be demanded at the given price. All right? There won't be any surplus on either side. All right, so we'll look at an example of a supply and demand function where we'll find market equilibrium, because that's what we're going to do. When we find our market surplus, we're going to look at it in terms of the market equilibrium, the perfect market. And again, like I said, usually competitive markets tend to fluctuate near market equilibrium. Alright, so market equilibrium is when supply is equal to demand. That's what market equilibrium, alright? It's the intersection point when we sketch the graph of the function. It's where the two functions intersect. Alright, so I'm going to do a simple sketch of this. We will probably be using our calculator for most of the problems, so I'll do the calculator in later examples. This one I'm just going to sketch by hand. Alright, so remember, X represents items. So it only makes sense that I can have positive items. So the domain for these is always 0 to infinity. You only graph in the first quadrant, alright, the positives. You only want positive items. You can't have negative items. Alright, so I'll always start at the 0. Alright, so when I'm going to graph these, first quadrant's all I'm going to graph. We start at the 0. This would be going off to the infinities, positive infinities. This would represent my items. This represents the price. All right, and the price is always, always positive. All right, so in our case, the y value is the price. The x value is the item. So if I start with the supply curve, it's a parabola that's opening up. When I plug 0 in, 0 items produced, I get 0 supply, 0 price for the supply. All right, so we start at 0. And then it's just a parabola that it's open up. So I'm just going to do, and it's only part of a parabola. So I'm just going to do this. This is the s of x, which represents my x squared plus 15x. All right, and it is an increasing function. Starts at 0, starts at the point 0, 0. And then my demand function is a line, right? It's a line, the slope is -5, the y-intercept is 800. So I'm going to start with the y-intercept 800. I'm just going to mark it up here. I'm going to say this is the 800. Meaning when the price is set at 800, nobody will buy the item. 0 items will be purchased. That's the maximum price where we can't sell any items. And then it's decreasing, so I know it's a line that's moving down. And -5 is a lot smaller than where we started, so I'm not going to decrease it very fast. I'm going to decrease it fairly slow. And it's a line, so it's a straight line. And so there's my dx, which is 800 minus 5 dice. And we will graph this later on the calculator. This moment here, that's the equilibrium. Alright, that is when my supply equals my demand. And that's the point we want to find. We want to find this moment, which I'm going to label X sub E. That's my equilibrium quantity. And that's going to be a very important point. And then over here would be the P sub E. This would be the equilibrium price. Alright, the price that we would set where the people are willing to buy X of these items and the consumer or the producers are willing to supply, right? So they're going to sell exactly the same amount that they're going to supply. And that's the equilibrium point. Right? The equilibrium point. We're going to do this example later on where I'll actually find it graphically. Actually, I might go ahead and find it graphically or by hand in this case. If you graph the function, you'll find that the equilibrium quantity, when these two functions intersect, equilibrium quantity is 20, the equilibrium price was 700. This point would be 2,700. And I'll go over how to do that graphically in later examples, alright? So, our equilibrium point, so that means whatever X represents, in the perfect market, they will sell 20 items at a price of $700. They'll also supply 20 items at a price of $700. And actually, I think we know what our items are. Office desk. So it means in this particular market, this fancy, I'm assuming it's a fairly fancy, nice, ergonometric office desk. And it'd be a fairly small market, and ours will typically be fairly small markets. If they set their price for their office desk at $700, they'll sell 20 of them, and that's sort of the perfect market. So they'll supply 20 and they'll sell 20. So suppose they're going to give these desks to Costco, right? And so Costco's going to put them on display and have them in their storage. And so if they set the price to $700, well, they know that if they set it to $700, 20 people should buy it. And that's what they're willing to do. The suppliers are willing to do that. They're willing to have 20 of these desks, or 20 of these office desks at Costco for $700. Right? They're willing to supply that amount at that price. All right, so that's sort of the idea, the equilibrium moment. All right, then we're going to get into consumer surplus and producer surplus, and so I'll do that in the next video.